The silence between houses at 3 a.m. carries secrets that daylight would never dare reveal. Sarah Mitchell pressed her palm against the cool window glass, watching the Henderson house across the street, where a single light flickered in what she knew was their basement. Her husband Michael had been restless for weeks, tossing and turning beside her, muttering their neighbors' names in his sleep like a broken prayer. The list had changed everything. That yellowed piece of paper with its careful handwriting and the unmistakable entry. Michael Mitchell, 47, accountant, 1247 Maple Street. She could still feel the weight of it in her trembling fingers. Could still see the way Michael's face had drained of all color when she'd shown it to him. The renovation of the Henderson house had started innocently enough, with Jackie Henderson apologizing profusely about the noise and dust. "Just updating the old electrical system," she'd said with that warm smile that had fooled them all for 15 years of neighborly dinners and borrowed lawn equipment. But when the contractors had torn into the wall between the kitchen and dining room, they'd found more than outdated wiring. Sarah remembered the young worker's confused expression as he'd handed her the envelope, assuming it had fallen from their own house during the shared wall repair. The paper inside was brittle with age, covered in a meticulous script that listed names, addresses, and intimate details about people throughout their quiet, suburban neighborhood. Michael had insisted they were overreacting, that there had to be a reasonable explanation for why their personal information was hidden in the Hendersons' wall. "Maybe it's an old insurance document," he'd suggested, his voice hollow and unconvincing even to himself. But Sarah had seen the other names on that list, had recognized their mailman, their daughter's teacher, the elderly couple 3 houses down, who died in that suspicious house fire last spring. Each entry was accompanied by notes that made her blood run cold. Allergic to shellfish, takes heart medication, walks alone Tuesday evenings, spare key under flower pot. These weren't the casual observations of friendly neighbors. They were the careful notations of someone studying prey. The Hendersons had been watching them all, collecting their vulnerabilities like a predator mapping hunting grounds. Sarah's hand shook as she remembered Jackie's knowing smile whenever she'd mentioned Michael's business trips. How Bob Henderson always seemed to appear whenever she was alone in the garden. Every shared barbecue, every borrowed cup of sugar, every casual conversation over the fence had been an intelligence-gathering mission disguised as suburban pleasantry. The realization hit her like a physical blow. They had been living next to something monstrous for 15 years, something that wore the mask of neighborly kindness while cataloging their weaknesses. Now, staring at that basement light flickering in the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah wondered if tonight was the night their names would finally be crossed off that terrible list. The morning after Sarah's sleepless vigil brought an unnaturally bright sun that seemed to mock the darkness growing in her heart. Michael sat at their breakfast table, methodically cutting his toast into perfect squares while avoiding her eyes. The yellow envelope spread between them like evidence of their impending doom. She watched him eat with mechanical precision. This man she'd loved for 20 years, now feeling like a stranger marked for some unspeakable fate. The list lay there, taunting them with its terrible implications, each name a potential victim in whatever sick game their neighbors were playing. When the doorbell rang at exactly 8 o'clock, they both froze, knowing without looking that Jackie Henderson stood on their porch with her trademark casserole dish and predatory smile. Jackie's voice carried through the door like poisoned honey, sweet and sickeningly familiar, as she called out her usual morning greeting. "Morning, neighbors. Brought you some of that coffee cake you love so much, Michael." Sarah felt bile rise in her throat at the way Jackie emphasized her husband's name, as if savoring the taste of it. Michael's hands trembled as he folded the list, tucking it into his shirt pocket like a talisman against the evil that lived 20 feet away. Through the peephole, Sarah could see Jackie's perfectly manicured appearance, her flowered apron, and grandmother's smile, the same costume she'd worn to deceive them for over a decade. The woman's eyes, however, held something new. A glittering anticipation that made Sarah's skin crawl, with recognition of a hunter who knew her prey was cornered. They pretended not to be home, standing frozen in their own kitchen like children hiding from monsters. Jackie knocked again, then again, each rap against the door more insistent than the last, as if she could sense their presence and was growing impatient with their games. "I know you're in there," she called out, her voice losing its honeyed tone for just a moment, before snapping back to its false warmth. "Michael, I saw your car in the driveway. Don't be silly." Sarah watched through the window as Jackie walked around their house, peering into windows with the casual entitlement of someone who believed she owned everything she surveyed. The woman's movements were predatory now, no longer bothering to maintain the pretense of a concerned neighbor, her true nature bleeding through like ink through wet paper. When Jackie finally retreated to her own house, Sarah saw her stop at the property line and turn back with a smile that never reached her eyes. The older woman stood there for a full minute, staring directly at their kitchen window as if she could see through the curtains to where they cowered inside. She raised her hand in a slow, deliberate wave, her fingers wiggling with the patronizing gesture one might make to a small child. Then she mouthed words that Sarah could read clearly despite the distance. "See you soon." The casual malice in that simple phrase sent ice through Sarah's veins, a promise wrapped in threat, a countdown to something terrible that their neighbors had been planning, for God only knew how long. The silence that followed Jackie's departure felt heavier than the house itself, pressing down on them with the weight of 15 years of carefully constructed lies. Michael finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have to leave. Today. Right now." But even as he said it, they both knew it was too late. Whatever the Hendersons had planned was already in motion, and their names on that list meant they were trapped in a game whose rules they didn't understand. Sarah pulled the curtains closed, sealing them into their own home like a tomb, while outside, the Henderson house sat in perfect suburban stillness, hiding its secrets behind manicured hedges and fresh paint. The morning sun continued to shine with obscene brightness, illuminating a neighborhood where evil had learned to smile and wave, where predators brought casseroles and borrowed lawnmowers, where a simple piece of paper had revealed that home was no longer safe. The police officer's dismissive tone cut through Sarah's desperate explanations like a blade through tissue paper. "Ma'am, having your neighbor's personal information isn't illegal," Officer Martinez said, barely glancing at the yellowed list that represented their world crashing down. Could be anything. Old neighborhood directory, insurance records. Maybe they were planning a block party. Michael sat beside Sarah in the sterile police station, his face gray with exhaustion and defeat as their last hope for salvation crumbled into bureaucratic indifference. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects, casting harsh shadows that seemed to mock their terror with their clinical brightness. Sarah wanted to scream that they weren't paranoid suburbanites jumping at shadows. They were prey who had finally discovered they'd been living next to apex predators disguised as cookie-baking neighbors. The drive home felt like a funeral procession, their car moving through streets that no longer felt familiar or safe. Every house they passed seemed to watch them with hidden eyes. Every neighbor working in their yard might be another collector of secrets, another smiling predator cataloging weaknesses for some future harvest. Michael gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, taking a route that avoided Maple Street entirely, as if he could somehow delay their return to the Hendersons' hunting ground. When they finally turned onto their street, Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird sensing the approach of a cat. The Henderson house sat in perfect suburban tranquility, its freshly painted exterior hiding whatever horrors lived within those walls. Bob Henderson was in his front yard, trimming hedges with the methodical precision of a man who had all the time in the world. He looked up as their car approached, his face breaking into that familiar neighbor's smile that had once seemed warm and now appeared absolutely Reptilian. Sarah watched in horrified fascination as he raised his hand in greeting, the same casual wave he'd given them 1,000 times before. But now she could see the calculation behind his eyes. He was studying them, she realized. Noting their pallor, their obvious distress, feeding on their fear like a vampire drawing sustenance from terror. When Michael reluctantly waved back, Bob's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too predatory for his grandfatherly face. Inside their house, they discovered that someone had been there during their absence. Nothing was missing, but everything felt wrong, contaminated by invisible hands that had touched their most private spaces, of monsters under the bed. Michael found his home office subtly disturbed, papers rearranged with surgical precision, his computer showing signs of recent use, despite being password protected. Sarah's jewelry box had been opened and carefully closed, her most treasured pieces handled by fingers that had no right to touch them. The violation was complete but nearly invisible, the work of someone who had practice invading homes without leaving obvious traces. They were being studied, catalogued, prepared for something that neither of them could yet comprehend, but both feared with every fiber of their being. The phone rang at exactly 6 o'clock, its shrill sound cutting through the heavy silence like a scream. Sarah's hand hovered over the receiver, knowing with terrible certainty who would be on the other end. Jackie Henderson's voice poured through the speaker like syrup laced with arsenic. "Hello, dear. Just wanted to make sure you got my coffee cake this morning. I left it on your porch when you didn't answer." The lie was delivered with such casual confidence that it took Sarah's breath away. There had been no coffee cake, no attempt at normal neighborly contact, just the predatory smile and whispered threats. But Jackie continued as if nothing had happened, her voice full of manufactured concern. "You and Michael seemed so upset when you drove by earlier. I do hope everything's all right. Bob and I have been worried about you both." The words were spoken with perfect inflection, each syllable designed to sound caring, while delivering the unmistakable message. "We're watching you. We know your every move, and there's nowhere you can hide." The basement of the Henderson house had become Sarah's obsession, that single flickering light drawing her to the window each night, like a moth to flame. Through stolen glances and careful observation, she began to notice patterns. The light appeared every Tuesday and Friday at exactly 2:47 a.m., stayed on for precisely 43 minutes, then disappeared until the next appointed time. Michael found her there each morning, standing at their bedroom window with dark circles under her eyes, watching their neighbor's house as if it might reveal its secrets through sheer force of will. The regularity of the light suggested ritual, something that required darkness and privacy, something that couldn't be done during the daylight hours when suburban propriety demanded smiles and waves. When Sarah shared her discovery, Michael's face went ashen, and she knew he was thinking the same terrible thought. What happened every Tuesday and Friday in that basement for exactly 43 minutes? The answer came accidentally, the way truth often does, slipping through cracks in carefully constructed lies. While researching property records at the county courthouse, Sarah discovered that 3 previous residents of their street had died under unusual circumstances, all on Tuesdays or Fridays, all between the hours of 2:30 and 3:30 a.m. Margaret Thompson from 1251. Maple had suffered a fatal allergic reaction to shellfish, despite never eating seafood. Harold Peterson from 1239 had died from a heart attack caused by his medication being mysteriously replaced with placebos. Elderly Rose Collins from 1255 had fallen down her basement stairs on a Tuesday night, breaking her neck on impact. The pattern was there, hidden in the mundane records of suburban mortality, a constellation of death that orbited around the Henderson house like planets around a malevolent sun. Each victim had lived within 3 blocks of the Hendersons. Each had died during those mysterious 43-minute windows, and each had their personal information carefully noted on that terrible list, Sarah's hands shook as she spread the death certificates across their kitchen table, connecting dots that painted a picture of calculated murder spanning decades. The Hendersons weren't just collecting information. They were harvesting lives with the methodical precision of farmers tending to crops. Michael studied the documents with the desperate intensity of a man trying to solve his own murder before it happened, his accounting background helping him see the statistical impossibility of so many convenient deaths. 3 blocks, he whispered, tracing the radius around their street with a trembling finger. They never go beyond 3 blocks. It's like they have a territory. The realization that they lived at the center of a killing ground made Sarah's stomach lurch with nauseous terror. They weren't just neighbors to the Hendersons. They were livestock in a carefully managed herd, cattle being fattened for slaughter. The doorbell rang again at exactly 8 a.m., the same time as yesterday. The same artificial cheerfulness in Jackie's voice as she called through the door. But this time, Sarah crept to the side window and watched as Jackie waited on their porch, noting how the older woman's head tilted slightly, listening for sounds from within. When no one answered, Jackie didn't retreat immediately as she had before. Instead, she walked to each window, pressing her ear against the glass with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times. She moved around their house like she owned it, checking locks, testing windows, mapping their home's vulnerabilities with the casual entitlement of a predator marking territory. Sarah held her breath as Jackie paused at their hiding place, the woman's face just inches from the glass, so close that Sarah could see the calculation in her eyes as she searched the shadows within. When Jackie finally left, she stopped at the end of their driveway and pulled out a small notebook, writing something down with quick, precise strokes. Sarah watched in horror as the woman looked directly at their house and smiled, the expression of such pure malice that it seemed to poison the very air around her. Then Jackie did something that made Sarah's blood freeze. She held up the notebook and pointed at it, mouthing the words, "Soon, dear," with exaggerated precision. The message was clear. They were being studied, catalogued, prepared for harvest like all the others before them. As Jackie walked back to her house, her movements held the satisfied swagger of a hunter who knew her prey had nowhere left to run. The Tuesday and Friday appointments in the basement suddenly took on a terrifying new meaning. They weren't rituals of the past, but preparation sessions for the future, rehearsals for murder yet to come. The hardware store clerk looked at Michael with barely concealed suspicion as he purchased deadbolts, security cameras, and motion sensors with the desperate urgency of a man building a fortress. Home invasion in the neighborhood. Michael lied, his voice cracking under the weight of a truth far more terrifying than simple burglary. Sarah waited in the car, jumping at every shadow, every passerby who might be another one of the Hendersons' accomplices in whatever network of suburban predators they'd stumbled into. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and she found herself studying each person who walked by, wondering if they too kept lists of neighbors hidden in their walls, if the entire concept of community was just an elaborate hunting blind. When Michael finally emerged with bags full of security equipment, his face held the grim determination of a soldier preparing for siege. Installing the cameras revealed disturbing patterns in their neighbors' behavior that had been invisible to their trusting eyes for 15 years. The footage showed Bob Henderson walking their property line each morning at dawn, his route taking him close enough to peer into their windows while maintaining the pretense of an early morning stroll. Jackie made 3 separate trips past their house each day, always at slightly different times, always finding excuses to linger, checking their mailbox for misdelivered packages, retrieving imaginary items from their shared property line, stopping to admire Sarah's garden with the focused attention of someone memorizing defensive positions. Most disturbing were the night visits, captured in grainy infrared as shadowy figures moved through their backyard with practiced stealth, testing windows and doors with the patience of professionals casing their next target. The recordings showed that their home had been under surveillance for months, maybe years, watched and studied like a laboratory specimen by neighbors they had trusted with spare keys and vacation plans. The breaking point came when Sarah discovered the Hendersons had been in their house again, this time leaving behind a calling card that made their intentions unmistakably clear. On her nightstand, placed with deliberate precision beside her sleeping medication, was a single white lily, the same flower that had been found on the graves of Margaret Thompson, Harold Peterson, and Rose Collins. The lily was fresh, still damp with morning dew, placed there while they slept just feet away. A message that no lock or camera could keep their predators out when they decided the time was right. Michael found his own lily on his desk, laid across his calendar on the date circled in red ink. Next Tuesday. The symbolism was elegant in its simplicity. Lilies for the dead, dates for the dying, a countdown to murder, delivered by killers who took pride in their craft. They were no longer just names on a list. They had graduated to active targets with an expiration date stamped in flower petals and red ink. Calling the police again proved futile, Officer Martinez treating their terror like the paranoid fantasies of overwrought suburbanites. "Flowers aren't a crime, folks," he said with condescending patience, bagging the lilies like he was humoring children afraid of monsters under the bed. The security footage showing the Hendersons prowling their property was dismissed as neighbors being neighborly. The death certificates Sarah had gathered, labeled as coincidental, despite their obvious pattern. When Sarah mentioned the list found in the wall, Martinez's expression shifted to one of professional concern. Not for their safety, but for their mental health. "Maybe you folks should talk to someone," he suggested with the patronizing tone of authority dealing with civilian hysteria. Stress can make people see patterns that aren't really there. As they left the police station for the second time, Sarah realized they were completely alone, trapped in a suburban nightmare where predators wore badges of respectability and victims were dismissed as delusional. The drive home felt like returning to a slaughterhouse, their house no longer a sanctuary, but a carefully prepared killing ground where they would wait for Tuesday to arrive. Michael gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, taking every back route he could think of, as if postponing their return might somehow postpone their fate. When they finally turned onto Maple Street, the Henderson house seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, its perfect exterior hiding the machinery of death that operate in its basement during those mysterious 43-minute sessions. Bob Henderson was in his yard again, trimming the same hedge he'd worked on yesterday, his movements mechanical and purposeful as he watched their car approach. This time he didn't wave, didn't smile. He simply stared with the cold assessment of a butcher evaluating meat, his eyes following their car until it disappeared into their garage. The message was clear. The pretense was over. The game had entered its final phase. And Tuesday was only 3 days away. Sunday arrived with an oppressive heat that seemed to press down on Maple Street like a fever, the air thick with humidity, and the promise of storms that never came. Sarah hadn't slept in 48 hours, her body running on pure adrenaline and terror as she monitored their security cameras from a makeshift command center in their bedroom. The footage revealed an escalating pattern of surveillance. The Hendersons no longer bothered to hide their reconnaissance, walking openly through the Mitchells' backyard, testing windows, and examining the new security measures with professional interest. Michael paced the house like a caged animal, checking locks compulsively, his accounting mind trying to calculate odds of survival that grew grimmer with each passing hour. They had barricaded themselves in their own home, prisoners of suburban terror waiting for executioners who brought casseroles and smiled over garden fences. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They had spent 15 years building what they thought was the perfect neighborhood relationship, only to discover they'd been cultivating their own killers. The afternoon brought visitors, a steady stream of neighbors who had never shown such intense interest in the Mitchells' welfare before today. Mrs. Chen from 2 houses down stopped by with homemade soup, her eyes scanning their security cameras with uncomfortable intensity before asking detailed questions about their recent troubles. The mailman lingered unusually long at their box, sorting through letters with suspicious thoroughness, while glancing repeatedly at their windows. Even the teenage boy who mowed lawns throughout the neighborhood found excuses to work near their property line, his movements too precise, too observant for casual yard work. Sarah watched from behind curtains as each visitor exchanged subtle signals with the Henderson house. A nod here, a gesture there, communications in a language of complicity that made her realize how isolated they truly were. The entire street seemed to be in on whatever was planned for Tuesday, a community conspiracy disguised as suburban normalcy. As evening approached, the temperature dropped suddenly, bringing with it an unnatural stillness that made every shadow seem pregnant with threat. Michael discovered their landline had been cut, the wire severed with surgical precision just outside their bedroom window, eliminating their ability to call for help during the crucial nighttime hours. Their cell phones showed no signal, though they had never experienced coverage issues before. Somehow their communication had been systematically severed, isolating them completely from the outside world. Sarah tried their neighbor's Wi-Fi network and found it password protected, with a phrase that made her blood run cold. 43 minutes. The exact duration of those mysterious basement sessions. They were being toyed with now, their killers taking pleasure in demonstrating the completeness of their trap, the futility of resistance against such methodical preparation. The Hendersons weren't just murderers. They were artists of terror, crafting each victim's final hours with sadistic precision. The basement light came on at exactly 2:47 a.m., but this time it wasn't alone. Every house on their block showed similar illumination in windows that had been dark for years. Sarah counted 7 separate locations, each one pulsing with that same steady rhythm, like a heartbeat synchronized across the entire neighborhood. Through her telephoto lens, she could see figures moving in the Hendersons' basement, more people than just Bob and Jackie, a gathering of suburban killers holding what appeared to be a planning session. The meeting lasted exactly 43 minutes, just as it had every Tuesday and Friday for weeks. But now Sarah understood the true purpose. These weren't rituals for the dead. They were strategy sessions for the living, detailed planning meetings for the next harvest of carefully selected victims. When the lights finally went out, the silence that followed felt absolute, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath in anticipation of what Tuesday would bring. Monday morning brought no relief, only the crushing weight of inevitability, as their final day dawned bright and mockingly cheerful. Jackie Henderson appeared on their porch at exactly 8 a.m. with a covered dish, but this time she didn't ring the doorbell or call out cheerful greetings. Instead, she simply stood there for 10 minutes, holding the casserole and smiling directly at their security camera, with an expression of such pure malice that it seemed to radiate through the electronic feed. When she finally set the dish down and walked away, Sarah saw that it was labeled in neat handwriting, "For the condemned." The casual cruelty of the gesture, the certainty of their fate expressed in a grandmother's neat script on a helpful neighbor's casserole dish, broke something inside Sarah that she hadn't known could be broken. They weren't just going to die. They were going to be consumed by the very community they had trusted, processed by neighbors who had spent 15 years learning their habits, their weaknesses, their fears. Tomorrow was Tuesday, and 43 minutes after 2:47 a.m., Michael and Sarah Mitchell would join the list of convenient deaths that had been feeding the Hendersons' appetite for over 2 decades. Tuesday's dawn broke red and ominous, the sky bleeding crimson across Maple Street, as if nature itself was mourning what was to come. Sarah and Michael had spent their final night awake, holding each other with the desperate intensity of condemned prisoners watching the clock count down to execution. Every sound seemed amplified, the settling of the house, the whisper of wind through trees, the distant hum of suburban life continuing obliviously around them. Michael had tried one last time to convince Sarah to run, to abandon their home and flee to some distant city where the Hendersons' influence couldn't reach. But they both knew it was too late. Their car wouldn't start, despite showing no mechanical problems. Their credit cards had been mysteriously frozen, and even their emergency cash had vanished from its hiding place. The Hendersons had severed every avenue of escape with the thoroughness of predators who had perfected their craft. They were trapped in their own home, waiting for nightfall and the 43 minutes that would end their lives. The day passed with surreal normalcy, neighbors going about their routines as if this Tuesday was no different from any other. Bob Henderson mowed his lawn with mechanical precision, the sound of the mower creating a peaceful suburban soundtrack that mocked their terror. Jackie tended her flower garden, occasionally looking up to wave at their windows with that predatory smile that had become her true face. Children played in yards, dogs barked at squirrels, mail was delivered with cheerful efficiency, the entire theater of normalcy playing out around them while they sat in their house like actors waiting for their death scene. Sarah found herself memorizing details. The way afternoon light fell across their kitchen table, the sound of Michael's breathing beside her, the familiar weight of their wedding rings, trying to imprint these final moments before the Hendersons claimed them. The casual indifference of the world to their plight felt almost as terrifying as the approaching murder itself. As evening approached, their security cameras captured the arrival of participants in the night's festivities. Cars parked discreetly throughout the neighborhood, their occupants emerging with the casual confidence of people attending a familiar social function. Sarah recognized some faces. Mrs. Chen with her suspicious soup, the mailman who had lingered too long, the teenage lawn boy with his two observant eyes. But others were strangers, drawn from God knew where to participate in whatever ritual the Hendersons conducted in their basement. Each person carried a small bag or toolkit, their movements coordinated with the precision of a well-rehearsed performance. They gathered in the Hendersons' backyard, perhaps 20 people in total, chatting quietly among themselves like guests at a garden party, their voices carrying the subdued excitement of people anticipating entertainment. Sarah watched through her telephoto lens, counting faces, memorizing features, documenting the suburban monsters who were about to feed on her and Michael's terror. At 2:30 a.m., the basement light came on for the final time. But now Sarah could see clearly what transpired during those 43 mysterious minutes. The participants descended into the Hendersons' basement in single file, their movements ritualistic and practiced, like congregants entering a familiar church. Through the narrow basement windows, she caught glimpses of what appeared to be an altar or table surrounded by chairs arranged in a perfect circle, candles casting dancing shadows on walls that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The gathering had the atmosphere of a ceremony, complete with formal roles and procedures that spoke to decades of practice. Jackie Henderson stood at the center, holding what appeared to be a photograph. Sarah's heart stopped as she realized it was a picture of her and Michael, taken during last year's block party, their smiling faces captured in a moment of trust that now felt like innocence lost. The Hendersons weren't just killers. They were cult leaders, orchestrating ritualistic murders with their neighbors as willing participants in suburban Satanism, disguised as community involvement. At exactly 2:47 a.m., the procession emerged from the basement and began walking across the street toward the Mitchell house. Sarah counted 23 people moving in perfect formation, their faces calm, with the serenity of believers fulfilling a sacred duty. Bob Henderson led the group, carrying a set of keys that Sarah recognized with sick certainty. Their own house keys, somehow duplicated during one of the many times they had trusted their neighbors with access to their home. Jackie walked beside him, still holding their photograph like a portrait of the deceased, her grandmother's face transformed into something ancient and hungry in the candlelight carried by the procession. Michael gripped Sarah's hand as they watched their killers approach. 23 suburban predators coming to collect the harvest they had been cultivating for 15 years. The front door lock turned with a quiet click, and Sarah understood that their 43 minutes had finally begun, the countdown to becoming just 2 more convenient deaths on Maple Street, 2 more names to be crossed off the Hendersons list with satisfied efficiency and ritual precision. The sound of their front door opening with surgical quietness sent ice through Sarah's veins as 23 pairs of footsteps moved through their home with practiced stealth. Michael pulled her toward the bedroom window, their escape route planned but never really believed in, their hands shaking as they struggled with locks that suddenly felt foreign and unmanageable. Below them, Bob Henderson's voice drifted up from their living room, warm and neighborly as he called out, "Michael, Sarah, there's no need to hide. We're all friends here." The casual tone, the same voice that had borrowed their lawnmower and complimented Sarah's roses, now carried the authority of a predator who knew his prey was cornered. Jackie's laughter followed, musical and grandmother sweet, the sound of someone savoring the final moments before a long-anticipated meal. Through the bedroom floor, Sarah could hear her neighbors moving through her house, examining her possessions with the entitled familiarity of people who had been planning this moment for years. The bedroom door handle turned slowly, deliberately, the brass knob catching moonlight like a golden eye, winking with malicious humor. Sarah and Michael pressed themselves against the window, the glass cold against their backs as their killers filled the doorway with shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse with malevolent life. Jackie Henderson stood at the center, still holding their photograph, her face transformed by candlelight into something ancient and hungry that had merely been wearing a neighbor's mask for 15 years. "Hello, dears," she said with the same tone she'd used to offer coffee cake and garden advice. "We've been looking forward to this for so long. You've been such perfect neighbors, so trusting, so predictable, so wonderfully unaware." Bob flanked her right side, his grandfather's smile revealing teeth that seemed sharper in the dancing shadows, while Mrs. Chen and the mailman and the teenage boy formed a circle around them like wolves surrounding wounded deer. The ritual began with Jackie opening an old leather book, its pages yellow with age and stained with substances that Sarah didn't want to identify. "Michael Robert Mitchell," Jackie read aloud, her voice taking on the formal cadence of a minister performing a sacred ceremony. "Accountant, 47 years old. Allergic to penicillin, takes blood pressure medication. Walks alone on Thursday evenings. Keeps spare cash in a coffee can behind his winter coats." Each intimate detail felt like a violation. Personal secrets gathered through 15 years of false friendship now recited like a catalog of weaknesses to be exploited. The circle of neighbors nodded with each revelation, their faces glowing with the satisfaction of a job well done. Predators who had successfully infiltrated their prey's life completely. When Jackie began reciting Sarah's information with the same clinical precision, Sarah realized that they had never really known their neighbors at all. They had been living next to strangers who studied them like insects under glass, collecting data for this final consumption. The true horror wasn't the approaching death, but the realization that their entire life on Maple Street had been an elaborate performance staged by their killers. Every shared meal, every borrowed tool, every friendly conversation over the garden fence had been part of a 15-year psychological experiment designed to maximize their terror in this final moment. Bob Henderson stepped forward, still wearing that familiar neighbor's smile, and explained with casual pride how they had orchestrated everything. The convenient deaths made to look like accidents, the careful selection of victims who wouldn't be missed immediately, the community network of suburban predators who fed on trust and innocence. "You see?" he said with the patient tone of a teacher explaining a difficult concept. "We've been doing this for 30 years now. Every few months we select someone from our feeding ground. That's what we call the neighborhood. And we take them. The ritual requires 43 minutes exactly, the time it takes for a human soul to fully separate from its body under proper conditions." Jackie nodded approvingly, adding, "And you two have been such delicious subjects, so full of life and hope. You'll make an excellent offering." But as the clock showed 3:29 a.m. and their 43 minutes approached its end, Sarah felt something shift inside her. Not acceptance of death, but fury at the betrayal, rage at 15 years of stolen trust and manufactured friendship. With desperate strength born from absolute terror, she grabbed Michael's hand and threw herself backward through the bedroom window, glass exploding around them as they crashed into the flower bed below. The impact drove air from her lungs and sent pain shooting through her body. But she could hear Jackie's enraged shriek from above. The ritual must be completed in the house. "Chase them!" 23 pairs of feet thundered down the stairs as Sarah dragged Michael toward their car, blood streaming from glass cuts, adrenaline overriding pain as survival instinct took control. Behind them, the Henderson house erupted with inhuman screams of fury. The sound of suburban predators denied their carefully planned feast, their 43 minutes ruined by prey that refused to submit quietly to consumption. As their car roared to life, mysteriously functional now that desperation had replaced resignation, Sarah saw the true faces of her neighbors in the rearview mirror. They stood in the street like demons caught in headlights, their masks of suburban normalcy finally discarded to reveal the ancient hunger beneath. Jackie Henderson raised their photograph above her head and tore it in half, the gesture carrying the weight of a curse, a promise that this wasn't over. But Sarah no longer cared about curses or promises of future revenge. She had learned that monsters didn't live under beds or in dark forests. They lived next door. They brought casseroles. They knew where you kept your spare keys. The Hendersons would find new neighbors to cultivate, new victims to harvest from their carefully tended suburban hunting ground. But Michael and Sarah Mitchell were no longer on their list, no longer part of their 43-minute rituals, no longer neighbors to people who had never been neighbors at all. As Maple Street disappeared behind them, Sarah realized they were the lucky ones. They had discovered the truth about their community and lived to tell about it, something that Margaret Thompson, Harold Peterson, and Rose Collins would never have the chance to do.